Okay, today we're going to attack getting the transmission off of the chassis here. A couple things we need to do. We need to disconnect the drive shaft. We're going to need to disconnect the cooling lines that go to the radiator. And to make that a bit easier, I'm going to take off the dipstick. The dipstick is merely pushed into the transmission case there with an O-ring for the seal. There's a little metal tie there, kind of like a zip tie, holding the kickdown cable to it. And then in the back here, there's a vacuum line. So that all comes out really easily. And now I'm set to go after the transmission cooling lines. My past experience is these are rust welded on, and you're not going to get them out without destroying the lines anyway, so, well, make a liar out of me. I doubt that I'm going to reuse these anyway, but if they come out cleanly, then that's a plus. And have to cut them in case they're hard to source them. These actually look like they're in pretty good shape. A little bit of wire wheel on them and some. What I like to use if I can get them all cleaned up and I want to reuse them is just clear engine paint that is high temperature. And it makes them look nicer longer. And it protects them from rusting, and I will do that even if I put new ones on. I did that on my 74 with brake lines, even though they were stainless steel. I did it with my fuel lines, even though they were brand new. And they still look brand new, and it's been 10 years. No, it doesn't get out in the water much, but it has been a couple times. If these had not come out easily, and the top one is still in question. And you know what, while I'm at it here, I don't think it makes any difference which direction they flow through the radiator cooler in, but I'm going to make a note of whether the bottom one here this one. The bottom one here is actually the bottom one into the radiator, and the top one here is the top one into the radiator. So there's a wee bit of fluid that was in the line there. See if we're as lucky on the second one. Yeah, we are. So these will come out clean. And depending on how bad they are, and whether I put this transmission back in, because I am looking at, it's called an A41 that has gearing more similar to TH400. And it also has an overdrive and a locking torque converter, so it's kind of pricey at $4,100, but I am at this point, with everything I'm putting into this car, I'm considering that, and I'm, as I've said before, I'm going to rebuild the engine. But basically, once I put a new steering on here and everything, it'll be almost like a new car if I do that. So it might end up being for all intents and purposes, almost a new car. By the time I'm done doing all the bushings and such. Now, if I recall correctly, these two have a clip underneath the onto the frame there, underneath the wheel, or the control arm, I should say. And that's why I can't get them out right now. So it's going to be a clip similar to this under there holding them. So I'll have to take that out before I can take out those lines. So that's disconnected, and the next thing is going to be going after the, I guess I'll go after the drive shaft next. I don't know if I mentioned on the last part there, there's nuts on the flare nuts were 1/2 inch. So that's the flare nut wrench. You need to take those off. Now the drive shaft here is held on by 2 little screws on each side of the universal joint. They are 7/16. I've got my 6.7/16 socket. These, generally speaking, aren't too tough. And it's a good thing, because if you break that off inside that yoke, it'd be a bear to get them out. So as you can see, those are all loose. Remove those from the yoke. The yoke should slip further back into the transmission to clear the U-joints once I get this disconnected. If not, I guess we'll move the transmission forward. Be ambidextrous here and look at 2 things at once. This is something that once I got it broke loose, I could have used an air ratchet on it. There's what the cap looks like once you get it off. Hopefully that's in the frame and you can see it. And once we're done with this, the next thing will be to hook up the hoist to it so that when I loosen the mount bolts, it doesn't go falling or something. There's the second one. I'm not going to try to push the yoke in yet. I want it to hold the drive shaft up, basically. So I've got this almost set up on the hoist. I put 2 screws through bell housing bolts, connected the chains to them. Now I'm putting the, it's kind of like a threaded U-bolt that connects this to the cross piece here. It's got a special bolt that goes in there. And there was a hole in the transmission case. Looks like it's made for lifting it. Right here. I just put a bolt through there and attach the bracket from the leveler. This has an adjustment that moves the connection here to level it. I don't know if I need it. And I'm going to have to undo the transmission mounts now. Okay, there's 2 ways I could go after this. The TH350 transmission apparently is somewhat shorter than the TH400, and they added an extra bracket here for the transmission mount. Okay, there's 2 bolts to the actual mount underneath. Looks like I'm going to need some more leverage on that. But there are 5/8 bolts going up through the actual transmission mount, which is the pad. Or alternatively, you could use 9/16 wrench. There's 2 bolts here and here, and there's 2 here and there. That seems to be an extra piece that they've added due to the shorter TH350. All this would have been easier to do, except that instead of finishing up the body, I wanted to let my grandson participate in taking apart pulling the engine. So the lift's occupied with the body right now, and getting the transmission off of here is part of what I need to do in order to move that. So I went a little bit the hard way, but he really enjoyed being able to take the engine out of a car. He's 9 years old, and he thought it was awesome. So there's 1 bolt. I just have a little extra pipe to give me a little extra leverage on the ratchet. So somewhere during that process my battery died. I don't know exactly where or exactly what I said, so I'm going to give you a quick, in a nutshell, synopsis of what I did. there's a bracket here. It's held on with 4 9/16 bolts. That was not on the 74 that had the TH400 transmission, so that was added to accommodate the shorter TH350 without changing everything else. So there's a padded mount here held on with 2 5/8 bolts with big washers and lock washers that screw that to this plate right here. After I got those loosened, all I did was pry back the yoke into the transmission further, because that slides, and the drive shaft basically fell off. So this slides in and out. As you can see, I just pushed it back in, the drive shaft fell off. Now before I move the chassis anymore, I'll have to disconnect the drive shaft on the other end, but it's good to go. So what I'm going to do now off camera is just raise up that transmission high enough that I can wheel it over to my bench and set it down on my bench before I proceed with anything else on the chassis. Okay, so I've got the transmission sitting on the bench now, and as I was going to put in the screws back into the transmission mount, as I usually do so things don't get lost, I noticed this. The transmission mount appears to have been totally disconnected because it fell out whenever I lifted the transmission. So it's a bonded piece. First of all, I'm going to take off I thought I could get these with my fingers. The exhaust pipe hanger, which is interesting because this is a 76, and the 76 came with a single exhaust. This had duals, so I don't know if this is a standard piece on the 76. I suspect not, or it could be, and only one side of it is used. Maybe instead of just redesigning the piece, and they decided to just go with what they had, and instead of incurring costs of redesign and all that. Okay, I'm going to need a wrench for that. So once you've disconnected that torque converter from the engine, it really just slips onto the shaft of the transmission. Now, I'm not going to leave this off because there's still a little bit of fluid in there. I don't want dirt getting in it, but
in order to replace the seal, that would have to come off, and you pry the seal out and pound a new one in. And to put the torque converter back on, which should be partially filled with fluid when you do it, just lift it back out onto the shaft and wiggle it until it seats. Not sure if that's seated or not. There's 2 grooves in here. Like they're more or less in that position. Looks like it went back in about a ½ inch further, which is about the distance of those notches in the shaft coming out of the torque converter. So I put the exhaust hanger bolts back into the tail of the transmission here, and the transmission mount bolts back in here. While I was doing that, the thought I had was a warning. When you're tightening bolts into a transmission like this, it has an aluminum housing, and it's very easy to strip them, so you don't want to put much pressure on them at all. The best thing is to have a torque wrench and have it set properly so that you don't strip it out. Now they can be repaired if you do strip them out, but it involves drilling it out and inserting a thread repair, and you might be able to guess why I own this tool, because I have stripped them out. Basically, you drill the hole that bigger, there's a tap in there for you to thread the inside of that hole, and then there's a spring in there that reduces the new hole one size so that it's back to the original size bolt that you screw in, and they work quite well, but it's better to not have to use them than to have to use them. So here's another tip for you. Once you take apart these universal joints, those end caps come off really easily, and if they come off, you'll have needle bearings all over the floor, and it's tough to get them back in if you can even get them cleaned up enough so there's no dirt on them, because dirt will kill them. So any way you can, you need to make sure they don't fall off. Tape is one option. You can put a small clamp on them. There's a variety of ways you could do it. But you want to keep those things from coming off, because it's no fun trying to find them all. Or making a trip to a parts store, because you let the darn things fall all over the floor. that's the front. And I don't know if it's required, but I like to, if I'm going to reuse the same drive shaft, I like to put it in the same direction that it was. In other words, the front back in the front, the back reinstall it in the rear. So basically one of the ways you can identify how it was on to begin with is these balance weights, which there's generally one on each end. And on this one on the front, the balance weight is generally lined up with the yoke on the drive shaft. And on the back end, it's generally lined up with the open space rather than the metal part of the yoke. And I just decided that maybe it'd be a good idea if I check to see that the back U-joint is in the frame. And it's a good thing I did. Okay. So I'll point out what I mean about the balance weight in the rear being aimed towards the open spot of the yoke rather than the metal part of the yoke. So in the front, the balance weight was right about here, lined up with the metal part of the yoke. And on the back here, I just put all this stuff and turn it over. Well, maybe I'll have to show that when I take it off because it's not turning real easily. I have to move the whole chassis. About having a U-joint there, you can move that drive shaft out of the way once you get to the bolts. Once it's disconnected on one of the ends. So I will take that off and tape up those caps on the end of the U-joint, and we'll have a chassis that I can roll around at will. So I'm ready to take that out. Just another couple tips, if you will. As you're pulling this out, it's a good idea to keep those caps pushed on. So if you can grab the caps with one hand and then pull it out, pull the drive shaft out with the other, that's a good thing. The other thing is, if you've got one of these up on top and one on bottom, you don't want to take the bottom retainer off first, because then the weight of the drive shaft can potentially pull that right out of that cap. got some corrosion holding that stuff on. If I'm not careful here, I'll be giving you a demonstration of why you don't want to let those caps come off. But I'm going to tape it up first. They're horizontal, so they shouldn't fall off. Hope I'm in the frame. So a couple, 3 wraps around there with the black tape, and it won't fall out. Truthfully, once I get a car down this far, I really don't generally want to reuse those universal joints, because you've done most of the work to replacing them. But here's what I meant about the balance weight. On this one, the balance weight is in between, this is the back, it's in between the 2 prongs that stick out on the yoke. And on the front end, it was pointing at the solid metal part right here. So I can identify that that's the way it was in there, that the front was that way, or this was the front of the drive shaft.